people working with us whose names are on the slide. This was a longitudinal study of desistance. We followed 113 male, mostly persistent offenders, born in 1982 to 84, and when we first interviewed them, they were aged 19 to 22, but most of them were aged 20 to 21 when we first encountered them. This was a deliberate decision to start the study at the top of the age crime curve, and nobody in this country has done this before. Deliberately start a project at the top of the age crime curve to see what happens in the next few years. We followed them for about 3 years, over 4 interviews, or at least we offered all of them 4 interviews. Not all of them accepted our kind offer, notwithstanding that it carried £10 with it. But nevertheless, our recontact rates, particularly when you consider who we're talking about here, were pretty good. And as you can see, even at the 4th interview, we managed to interview 78% of the original sample, and we interviewed 86% of the initial sample at either the 3rd or the 4th. And those of you who are researchers will know that it takes quite a lot of effort to achieve those kinds of response and recontact rates. These 113 male persistent offenders were taken from a population originally of 773 offenders, male and female, but there were these we generated from the police national computer, to which the Chief Constable of South Yorkshire kindly allowed us access. However, because of the constraints of the Data Protection Act, he said that we could not approach them ourselves. They would have to be approached by somebody from a criminal justice agency. In fact, the original suggestion was that the Chief Constable should himself write a letter to them, but we thought maybe not. What actually happened was that the probation service contacted them. If they were in prison, the probation service wrote them a letter. If they were in the community, the probation service were supposed to speak to them with a view to their joining the sample. For various reasons, it was easier to obtain positive responses from people in prison than from people in the community, not just because the people in prison were bored, although that certainly came into it, but because of the other pressures on the probation service, and probation staff frankly did not have recruiting for our study at the top of their list of job tasks. Therefore, in the end, about 80% of the sample were first interviewed in prison. That accounts for the fact that although the minimum test for inclusion in the sample was having at least 2 conviction occasions, in reality, as you'll see in a minute, there was an awful lot more than that. And here is the data on the criminality of the sample at the time when we first found them. And as you can see, the mean number of conviction occasions, that's separate times in court, on which they were convicted of a standard list offence. Not sure whether you use that language in Scotland. I think you don't, but it means theft, damage, sex, violence, etc. It doesn't include driving and administrative offences. So they had, by age 2021, they had 8, on average, 8 conviction occasions for standard list offences, and also a caution, on average 1 caution. So on average they had been caught and processed 9 times by the time we started by this time they started in our sample, for a standard list offence. That is a very high number. Many of you will be familiar with the most famous British longitudinal study, the Cambridge study of delinquent development, initially run by Donald West and subsequently by David Farrington. The Cambridge study, by the age of 40, had 686 conviction occasions in its sample. The sample was 411. There were about 160 of those 411 got convicted at all, and their total number of conviction occasions by age 40 was 686. Ours was 113 times 8.05, which is 909. So this is a significantly more criminal sample than the Cambridge study. In England, and I think not in Scotland, though I'm open to correction, we use, well, the Home Office, sorry, the Ministry of Justice uses something called the Offender Group Reconviction Score, known to its friends as OGRS. This is a very good and well-validated prediction score using information that is readily available on any criminal record. These are the predictive factors that go into OGRS. What you can see that most of them are crime ones. There are two age ones. One is age at first conviction, because the criminological data do show that in general, as Terry Moffat said, an early age at first conviction does predict further criminality, but also age at current conviction is there, picking up the importance of the age crime curve and the decline in the 20s. What you get out of OGRS is a percentage probability of reconviction in the next 2 years, and in this sample the mean OGRS score was 77, meaning that OGRS predicts that 77% of the sample will be reconvicted in 2 years, and the median is actually slightly higher, and for those of you who are good at stats, you will immediately spot that there is therefore a bit of a tail of less persistent offenders down at the end of the sample, but the majority are well up in the persistent end. In terms of Terry Moffat's age at first disposal, a very important variable, the sample divides rather nicely into three groups. The mean age at first disposal caution or conviction is 13.5, and these two bars between them constitute about a third of the sample. A third were first convicted after, or cautioned after the age of 14, and a third beforehand. And in case you're wondering about the 9, bearing in mind that the age of criminal responsibility in England and Wales is 10, yes, you're absolutely right. This was someone who had first been before the Scottish Children's Hearing System at the age of 9 and had then decided to migrate to Sheffield. We used a fairly standard, we told the police what we were doing. We used a fairly standard criminological self-reported technique. We actually used the method used by the Cambridge longitudinal study, where you give people cards. The offenders we found actually rather liked these cards. They have a pile of offences on them, you know, went into a shop and took something and so forth. And we went through the standard procedure of, first of all, sort the cards. Have you done any of these things in the last 12 months? If so, put the card on that side. Then pick up the yes cards and then go through them and tell me how often you've done these things.